The fluorescent lights hummed their institutional drone, that particular frequency that seemed designed to amplify headaches rather than prevent them. Norah King sat in a molded plastic chair that had probably been bolted to the floor since the Reagan administration, her fingers wrapped around a clipboard with enough force to whiten her knuckles. The intake form stared back at her, each checkbox a small accusation. Service-related injury. Her pen hovered over the box. 27 months since the fall. 27 months of fighting to be believed, to be heard, to be seen as something other than a liability or a liar, or a convenient problem that had solved itself through medical discharge paperwork. 27 months of waking up to headaches that felt like someone had replaced her skull with broken glass. Of light sensitivity so severe that overcast days felt like staring into the sun. Of memory gaps that appeared without warning and swallowed hours whole. She checked the box. The intake nurse, a woman in her 50s with scrubs decorated in cheerful cartoon bandages that somehow made the whole scene more depressing, glanced at the form, then at Norah, then back at the form. Her expression shifted through several phases of professional skepticism before settling on bureaucratic neutrality. "It says here you served with the 75th Ranger Regiment," the nurse said, her tone carefully flat. "As a combat medic," there it was. The slight pause before combat medic, as if the words themselves were questionable. As if the Ranger scroll tattooed on Norah's left forearm might be decorative rather than earned. As if women didn't bleed the same color as men when the bullets started flying. "That's correct," Norah replied, her voice measured. She'd learned to keep her tone level, professional, unthreatening. Angry women got dismissed even faster than traumatized ones. "And you're here for..." The nurse squinted at the form. "Traumatic brain injury? From a training accident? From an 8,000-foot fall?" Norah said quietly. "My parachute failed during a halo exercise." The nurse's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. 8,000 feet? "Yes, ma'am." "Into water?" "Yes, ma'am." The skepticism returned, now openly displayed. "And you survived?" "As you can see." The nurse made a note on her computer, probably flagging Norah's file with whatever code they used for exaggerated claims or attention-seeking behavior. Norah had seen that look before, worn it on dozens of faces. The Army doctors who'd suggested her memory problems were stress-related. The VA psychologist who'd asked if she was sure about the details of her fall. The disability claims examiner who'd outright called her confused about the timeline. Outside, a helicopter passed overhead, probably a news chopper following some traffic accident on the interstate. The sound cut through the waiting room's muzak like a blade, and Norah's hands began to tremble. Not fear, not exactly, more like muscle memory. Her body remembering something her conscious mind had tried desperately to forget. The waiting room dissolved around her. The C-130 squatted on the tarmac like a pregnant dragonfly, its cargo ramp yawning open to reveal the dim red interior lighting that marked every military aircraft Norah had ever boarded. The pre-dawn air carried the smell of jet fuel and freshly cut grass, an oddly domestic scent that always seemed incongruous with the business of learning to fall from extreme altitudes. Staff Sergeant Norah King adjusted the straps on her main chute harness, running through her pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through 3 deployments. At 5'6" and 130 pounds, she didn't cut the imposing figure of the male rangers scattered across the staging area, but her uniform bore the same tan beret, the same scroll, the same combat patches that marked tours in places the Army still classified as overseas contingency operations rather than wars. The joint training exercise had been in planning for 6 months. 40 personnel total, 32 from the 75th Ranger Regiment, 8 from Delta Force, or SFODD as it was officially designated, though everyone just called it Delta. The exercise objective was straightforward: test new high-altitude insertion protocols for combined arms operations, improve interoperability between regiment and Tier 1 units, and validate updated equipment packages for extreme environment operations. What it really meant was that a bunch of Rangers and a handful of Delta operators were going to jump out of a perfectly functional aircraft at 25,000 feet, free fall for most of it, and then hopefully land without breaking anything important. Norah's role was specific. She wasn't there as a primary jumper, but as a combat medic liaison. Delta's medical support protocols differed from Ranger standards, and recent joint operations in classified locations had revealed dangerous gaps in trauma response coordination. If a Delta operator got hit during an infiltration with Ranger support, would the Ranger medic know Delta's blood type coding system? Would they have the right equipment to interface with Delta's specialized trauma kits? Would communication protocols allow for effective casualty evacuation? Probably not, which was why Norah was standing on a tarmac at 0430 hours, preparing to jump from an altitude that would kill her instantly if her oxygen system failed. Sergeant King. She turned to find Captain Marcus Reeves, her company commander, approaching with a clipboard and the expression of a man who'd drawn the short straw for dealing with higher-level politics. "Sir," she acknowledged. "Last chance to back out," Reeves said, though his tone suggested he didn't actually expect her to take the offer. "This is still classified as a voluntary training evolution. Your mandatory requirements don't include Halo certification with Delta." Norah had heard this speech twice already, once from the battalion commander, once from her platoon sergeant. Each time, it had been framed as professional courtesy, but the subtext was clear. You're one of 2 women in this jump. If something goes wrong, it'll become a story about women in combat roles. Are you sure you want that responsibility? "I'm sure, sir," she said. "If we're going to improve joint protocols, someone from Regiment Medical needs to experience their insertion procedures firsthand." Reeves nodded, clearly having expected that answer. "Fair enough. Just remember, Delta doesn't baby-step their training. They're going to treat you like any other jumper. That means no slack, no special consideration, no." "I wouldn't want any, sir." "I know." Reeves almost smiled. "That's why you're doing this and Johnson isn't." Johnson was the other female medic in their battalion, a solid operator with 2 deployments and a gift for keeping combat trauma patients alive long enough to reach surgical facilities. She'd also declined the Halo exercise, citing family obligations. No one had questioned it. No one had needed to question it because Johnson didn't have the same thing to prove that Norah apparently did. The thing Norah herself wasn't entirely sure she understood. Across the staging area, the Delta operators clustered in their own group, easy to identify even without their distinctive unit patches. They moved with a particular quality that Norah had learned to recognize over multiple deployments. Not arrogance exactly, but the absolute confidence of people who knew they were the best at what they did and had the operational record to prove it. Where Rangers were aggressive and direct, Delta was surgical and precise. Where Rangers kicked down doors, Delta had already been inside for 20 minutes before anyone noticed. One of the Delta operators broke from the group and headed toward the equipment cages, passing close enough to Norah's position that she caught fragments of his conversation with a fellow operator. Command's pushing these diversity checkboxes into our exercises now, he was saying, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who'd had this conversation many times before. Next, they'll want us to hold their hands during infill. The second operator, a wiry man with a salt and pepper beard that would have gotten any conventional soldier sent to remedial grooming standards, shook his head. She's got the scroll. She's earned. Medics don't see what we see, the first operator interrupted. Let's see how she handles the real altitude. Norah kept her expression neutral, pretended she hadn't heard. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned her presence. Wouldn't be the last. The comments rolled off easier now than they had as a cherry private fresh to the regiment, back when every slight had felt personal. Every doubt had threatened to confirm her own worst fears about whether she belonged. She belonged. She'd proven it in 3 deployments, dozens of casualties stabilized under fire, a silver star for combat valor that most of the men who questioned her presence would never earn. She belonged, and she didn't need their validation to know it, but it still stung. Just a little. The first operator, Staff Sergeant Wade, according to his name tape, noticed her looking and offered a nod that might have been professional courtesy or might have been challenge. Hard to tell with Delta. Everything they did seemed layered with meaning. Wade was probably mid-30s, with the kind of unremarkable features that made excellent operators. Forgettable, average height, average build, the kind of person who could disappear into a crowd without effort. His eyes, though, were sharp and constantly moving, cataloging threats and vulnerabilities with the automated efficiency of a machine learning algorithm. "Sergeant King," he said, adjusting his trajectory to approach her position. "Looking forward to the exercise." "Same," Norah replied, waiting to see where this was going. "First halo jump?" "First at this altitude. I'm qualified through 15,000. Wade nodded as if she'd confirmed something he'd already known. "The altitude's no joke. Your O2 system fails at 25,000. You've got about 15 seconds of useful consciousness before you start making stupid decisions. After that, you're basically a meat missile. You good with altitude sickness? Any history of pressure-related issues?" "Medical clearance is in my file, Sergeant," Norah said carefully. "I appreciate the concern, but I'm good. Just checking." Wade's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We take care of each other up there. Doesn't matter what unit you're from." He walked away before Norah could respond, leaving her with the distinct impression that she'd just been evaluated and found, what, acceptable, questionable? It was impossible to read. The next 2 hours passed in the usual pre-jump routine. Equipment checks, oxygen system verification, altitude acclimatization protocols, final briefings on weather conditions and drop zone parameters. The sun crept over the horizon, painting the North Carolina sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Norah hadn't been mentally rehearsing emergency procedures for parachute malfunctions. At 0700 hours, they loaded into the C-130. The cargo bay of a C-130 in flight was a particular kind of hell that somehow felt like home. The engines roared at a frequency designed to destroy hearing and morale in equal measure. The red lighting turned everyone into zombie movie extras. The webbing seats guaranteed that at least 3 body parts would fall asleep before you reached altitude, and guaranteed that you'd never be sure which 3 until you tried to stand. Norah sat between 2 Rangers from her battalion, Sergeant First Class Martinez and Specialist Thompson, both of whom had more halo jumps than she had hot meals this month. Martinez was running through hand signals with Thompson, refreshing the communication protocols they'd use if radio systems failed at altitude. Good training, standard preparation, the kind of thing that separated professional soldiers from weekend warriors. Across the bay, the Delta operators sat in their own cluster, most with eyes closed and heads back against the bulkhead. They could have been sleeping, or they could have been running through mission profiles in their heads. With Delta, you never knew. They seemed to operate on a different circadian rhythm than the rest of humanity, capable of instant alertness after hours of apparent rest, or sustained operations for days without visible fatigue. Wade sat at the end of their row, eyes open, watching the Rangers with the expression of a professor observing a slightly disappointing undergraduate class. When his gaze landed on Norah, he held it for a moment longer than necessary before looking away. The loadmaster worked his way down the bay, checking oxygen connections and harness configurations. When he reached Norah, he paused, squinting at her O2 gauge in the red lighting. "Pressure looks good, Sergeant. You feeling okay? Any dizziness, nausea, vision changes?" "Negative," Norah said. "All systems green." The loadmaster moved on. Standard procedure. At 20,000 feet, the cabin was unpressurized, and everyone breathed through oxygen masks that made conversation nearly impossible. At 25,000, they'd switched to combat oxygen bottles for the jump itself, smaller, lighter systems that would last through the free fall and landing. The aircraft shuddered as it began its climb to jump altitude. Norah ran through her checklist again. Main chute, reserve chute, altimeter, oxygen bottle, radio, helmet cam. Helmet cam. She'd almost forgotten. This was officially a training documentation exercise, which meant several jumpers were wearing cameras to record the evolution for later analysis. Norah had volunteered to wear one, figuring the footage might be useful for future joint medical training. The camera mounted on her helmet's left side, small and unobtrusive, its battery indicator showing green. She made a mental note to download the footage after landing, then promptly forgot about it as the loadmaster gave the 10-minute warning. 10 minutes to altitude. 10 minutes to the point where they'd stand up, hook up to the aircraft's oxygen system for the final equipment check, and then step out into air so thin it would kill an unprotected human in minutes. Norah's heart rate picked up. Not panic, just anticipation. The body's natural response to preparing for something objectively insane. She'd trained for this. She was ready. Everything would be fine. Across the bay, Wade stood and made his way forward, moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. He stopped at Norah's position, leaning down to speak directly into her ear so she could hear him over the engines. "Quick check of your reserve ripcord housing," he shouted. "Mind if I take a look? Delta uses a different system. Want to make sure I understand regiment setup in case I need to assist on the way down." It was a reasonable request. Cross-unit training meant understanding different equipment configurations. Norah nodded and held still while Wade examined her reserve chute harness, his hands quick and professional as they traced the ripcord routing and pin configuration. "Looks good," Wade said after a moment, stepping back. "Clean setup. You'll do fine up there." He returned to his position. The loadmaster gave the 5-minute warning. Norah tried to shake off the odd feeling that had settled over her, the sense that something was just slightly wrong in a way she couldn't identify. Probably just pre-jump nerves. Completely normal. Nothing to worry about. The loadmaster gave the 1-minute warning, and then they were standing, forming up in jump order, double-checking each other's gear with the ritualistic precision of people whose lives depended on getting the details right. The cargo ramp began to lower, revealing the pre-dawn sky and the ground 8,000 feet below. The wind hit like a physical force, howling through the open cargo bay with enough violence to make standing upright a conscious effort. Norah shuffled forward in the jump order, her position third from the door, Martinez ahead of her and Thompson behind. The green light hadn't come on yet. which meant they were still making their final approach to the drop zone. Through her oxygen mask, her breathing sounded mechanical and distant, like she was listening to someone else's respiratory system. The altimeter on her wrist showed 25,000 feet, high enough that the curvature of the earth became visible, that the horizon seemed impossibly distant, that the ground below looked less like terrain and more like an abstraction rendered in brown and green pixels. The jumpmaster positioned himself beside the open ramp, one hand on a tether, the other ready to give the signal. The red light beside the cargo door seemed to pulse in Norah's peripheral vision, counting down to the moment when orderly preparation would give way to controlled chaos. Wade was positioned 2 jumpers behind Norah, close enough that she could hear his breathing through the radio static. Everyone's oxygen systems were linked to the common frequency for safety monitoring. His breath pattern was slower than hers, more controlled. Delta operators probably had Yoga Master lung capacity to go with their other superhuman attributes. The green light snapped on. The Jumpmaster's hand came down in a sharp motion. Martinez disappeared through the door, then the Ranger after him, and then it was Norah's turn. She didn't think, just moved, muscle memory taking over as she stepped into the void. The wind grabbed her immediately, spinning her into the classic free-fall position. Belly down, arms and legs spread for stability, head up to maintain orientation. The roar of the wind was absolute, drowning out everything except the essential. Altitude, heading, stability, countdown to deployment. The altimeter spun downward. 24,000 feet, 23,000, 22,000. Around her, other jumpers spread out across the sky, black shapes against blue, all falling in formation toward the drop zone marked by nothing more than GPS coordinates and faith in the calculations. This was the part that separated Halo from regular airborne operations. The free fall, the long descent through thin air, the minutes of absolute vulnerability where you were neither in the aircraft nor on the ground, just suspended in a space where human beings had no business being. Norah checked her formation position. Good. Holding steady on the heading. No major drift. She glanced at her altimeter again. 18,000 feet. Deployment altitude would be 8,000 feet for the main chute, with reserve deployment as low as 2,000 if the main failed. Plenty of altitude, plenty of time. Nothing to worry about, except the voice on the radio. It came through her helmet's communication system, distorted by wind noise and distance, but audible. She's been asking questions about the Somalia routing. Norah frowned behind her oxygen mask. Somalia routing. They weren't jumping into Somalia. This was a training exercise over North Carolina. Someone had their frequencies mixed up, probably discussing operational planning for a different exercise. Another voice, also male. Think she knows? The first voice again, and with a jolt of recognition, Norah identified it as Wade's, though the radio quality made it hard to be certain. Won't matter. Reserve's been static. Won't remember anyway if she... The transmission cut to static. Norah's attention snapped back to her altimeter. 12,000 feet. The conversation nagged at her. Pieces that didn't quite fit together. She? Were they talking about her? What was there to know about Somalia routing? And what did Wade mean about the reserve? 10,000 feet. Time to get ready for deployment. Norah brought her hands to her chest, locating the main chute ripcord by touch and muscle memory. At 8,000 feet, she'd pull, the main canopy would deploy, and she'd transition from free fall to controlled descent. Standard procedure. Done it 100 times in training, dozens of times for real. 8,000 feet. She pulled the ripcord. The drogue chute deployed. She felt the small tug as it extracted itself from the pack, felt the brief moment of relief as the main canopy began its deployment sequence, and then, nothing. The main chute's risers snapped tight, but there was no corresponding jerk of deceleration, no blossoming of fabric overhead. Norah looked up and saw the nightmare scenario every jumper trained for and prayed they'd never face. Her main canopy was twisted, collapsed, a useless tangle of suspension lines and fabric that was producing exactly zero drag. Training took over. Don't panic. Don't freeze. Execute the malfunction procedure. She kicked her legs and arched her back, trying to shake loose the twisted canopy. Sometimes that worked. Sometimes the airflow would untangle the lines and the canopy would deploy properly. But her altimeter showed 6,000 feet and dropping fast, which meant she had seconds, not minutes. The mainstay collapsed. Reserve procedure. Norah's hands found the reserve ripcord. A different location, different pull mechanism, specifically designed so that panicked jumpers couldn't confuse the two. She gripped the handle, pulled hard. The reserve chute extracted itself from its housing on her chest, the pilot chute pulling it free. She felt the initial deployment, felt the reserve beginning to open, and then it collapsed. Not twisted, not tangled, just collapsed, as if someone had cut the suspension lines halfway through deployment. The reserve canopy fluttered uselessly above her, providing just enough drag to slow her fall from terminal velocity to merely unsurvivable 5,000 feet. Norah's mind went crystal clear in the way it only did during the worst emergencies, when the brain stopped wasting time on fear and devoted all resources to problem solving. Her main was compromised. Her reserve was compromised. She was falling at approximately 100 miles per hour with no parachute and no backup plan. The ground below resolved into details: trees, a lake, an access road. The drop zone had been planned for the open field adjacent to the lake, but Norah's malfunction had thrown off her trajectory. She was heading for the water. Water. Terminal velocity impact with water was like hitting concrete, but 4,000 feet. But angle mattered. If she could control her descent vector, if she could hit the water at the right angle, feet first rather than flat, if she could protect her head and maintain consciousness long enough to reach the surface, it was a catastrophically bad plan. It would probably kill her, but it was the only plan she had. Norah pulled her arms tight to her sides, pointed her toes downward, and did her best to streamline her body for a vertical entry. The altimeter spun through 3,000 feet, 2,500, 2,000. Through the wind roar, she heard Wade's voice on the radio, clear as a bell. Shit, she pulled early. 1,500 feet. The lake rushed up to meet her, its surface no longer a flat abstraction, but a textured reality of waves and wind chop. She could see boats at the shoreline, could see the staging area where jump safety personnel were probably just now realizing something had gone catastrophically wrong. 1,000 feet. Norah King, Staff Sergeant, 75th Ranger Regiment, combat medic, Silver Star recipient, 27 years old, closed her eyes and prayed that the physics would work out in her favor just this once. 500 feet. The impact was not the immediate death she'd expected. It was worse. It was consciousness. It was pain. It was the sensation of every bone in her legs shattering simultaneously, of her pelvis cracking like an eggshell, of her spine compressing with enough force to herniate 3 discs before her body had time to register the damage. She hit the water at approximately 95 miles per hour at a 60-degree angle. The impact drove her 15 feet below the surface before her momentum bled off enough for buoyancy to take over. Her consciousness flickered like a faulty light bulb, on, off, as her body tried to decide whether it was more important to breathe or to maintain awareness. The helmet camera recorded everything: the impact, the underwater tumble, the moment when Nora's oxygen mask tore free and water rushed into her mouth and nose, the slow ascent back to the surface as her partially deployed reserve caught enough air to drag her upward. She broke the surface, gasping, choking, her mind a white void of pain and confusion. Somewhere close by, she could hear boat engines, voices shouting, the splash of rescue divers entering the water. Her last coherent thought before unconsciousness claimed her was this: Wade said the reserve wouldn't matter. He knew before I jumped. Then the world went dark, and stayed dark for a very long time. Consciousness returned in fragments, like a shattered mirror being reassembled one piece at a time. Norah became aware of pain first, a comprehensive whole-body pain that seemed to originate from her DNA itself. Then sound, medical monitors beeping, voices speaking in the clipped urgency of trauma response, the distinctive flutter thump of a helicopter somewhere nearby. Then light, too much light. Light that felt like ice picks being driven through her pupils directly into her brain. She tried to turn her head away from the light and discovered that her neck was immobilized in a cervical collar. She tried to move her legs and discovered that they were wrapped in splints and vacuum mattresses. She tried to speak and discovered that her mouth was full of tubes. "She's waking up," someone said, a woman's voice, calm and professional. "Sergeant King, can you hear me? Don't try to move. You're in the field hospital at Fort Bragg. You had an accident during the jump exercise." Norah tried to focus on the face hovering above her. A doctor, judging by the rank insignia and the white coat over ACUs. Early 40s, dark hair pulled back in a bun, eyes that had seen enough trauma to no longer be shocked by it. "Sergeant King, I'm Major Chen, trauma surgery. You've been unconscious for approximately 3 hours. Do you remember what happened?" Norah tried to answer, but the tube prevented coherent speech. She settled for a small nod, which sent lightning bolts of pain through her skull. "Good. That's good. Your parachute malfunctions caused you to impact the water at high velocity. You have bilateral leg fractures, pelvic fractures, spinal compression injuries, and severe traumatic brain injury. You're incredibly lucky to be alive." Lucky. That was one way to describe it. Major Chen continued her assessment, speaking in the efficient shorthand of military medicine. "Pupils responsive but unequal. Glasgow coma scale 15 now, but you were an 8 when they pulled you out. CT scan shows subdural hematoma, right frontal lobe, moderate size. We've got you on mannitol and we're monitoring for increased intracranial pressure. If you start declining, we'll transfer you to Walter Reed for neurosurgery, but right now you're stable enough to stay here." Norah tried to process this information through the fog of pain and whatever drugs they had her on. Subdural hematoma meant bleeding inside her skull. Frontal lobe meant potential problems with personality, decision-making, memory. The mannitol would reduce brain swelling, but if it didn't work, "Your legs will heal," Chen said, as if reading her thoughts. "The pelvic fractures will heal. The spine is compressed but not severed. You'll walk again, though it'll take months of physical therapy. The brain injury is the wild card. We won't know the full extent of the damage until the swelling goes down." Someone else entered Norah's field of vision, a young specialist with a clipboard and the expression of someone who'd been assigned the worst possible task. "Ma'am, the safety investigation team is asking when they can interview Sergeant King. Tell them 24 hours minimum," Chen said without looking away from Norah. "She needs to stabilize before we start interrogating her about what went wrong." But Norah needed to tell them now, before the memory fragments scattered like smoke. She grabbed Chen's wrist with more force than she'd intended. her fingers clumsy with whatever painkillers were in her IV. "Sergeant King, you need to—" Norah shook her head, ignoring the pain. She pointed at the breathing tube, then made writing motions with her free hand. Chen studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Get me a pen and paper." The specialist returned with a small notepad and a pen. Nora's hands shook as she took them, her fine motor control compromised by the head injury. Her first attempt at writing produced an illegible scrawl that could have been ancient Sumerian for all the sense it made. She tried again, concentrating fiercely on each letter. Radio, heard Wade, sabotage. Major Chen read the note, her expression shifting from professional concern to something more complicated. Skepticism mixed with worry, mixed with the special exhaustion that came from dealing with military politics. "Sergeant King," she said carefully, "you suffered severe head trauma. It's very common for TBI patients to experience confusion, false memories, auditory hallucinations." Norah shook her head violently, which was a mistake. The room spun, and her vision grayed at the edges. When the world stabilized, she wrote again, "Not hallucination. Helmet cam. Check, helmet cam." "Your helmet was damaged in the impact," Chen said. "I don't know if—" But Norah was already trying to sit up, trying to make them understand that this was important, that someone had tried to kill her, and they needed to check the evidence before it disappeared. The movement triggered every injury simultaneously, and the world dissolved into a supernova of pain that made her earlier suffering seem quaint by comparison. The monitors started screaming. Chen barked orders. Someone injected something into Norah's IV line, and consciousness mercifully fled again. When Norah woke the second time, the breathing tube was gone, replaced by a nasal cannula delivering supplemental oxygen. The light had been dimmed to a level that her traumatized brain could tolerate. The pain remained, but dulled to a more manageable roar by whatever pharmaceutical cocktail they'd mixed for her. A new face hovered in her field of vision. Male, late 30s, wearing the rank of captain, and the expression of someone who'd drawn an unpleasant assignment. "Sergeant King," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm Captain Williams, Safety Investigation Officer for the 16th Military Police Brigade. I need to ask you some questions about the accident." Not incident, accident. The word choice was telling. "Before we begin, I need to remind you that this is an official investigation. Your statements may be used in administrative or judicial proceedings. Do you understand?" Norah nodded, each movement of her head a calculated risk. "Good. Can you walk me through the jump from your perspective? What do you remember?" The question was loaded in about 6 different ways, but Norah didn't have the cognitive capacity to parse them all. She focused on the basics, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube. Main chute malfunctioned. Pulled reserve. Reserve failed to deploy properly. Impact with water. Williams made notes. "Did you follow proper pre-flight procedures? Equipment check, oxygen system verification, all that?" "Yes." "Did you notice anything unusual about your equipment before boarding the aircraft?" "No." "During the flight?" Norah hesitated. This was where it got complicated. Staff Sergeant Wade checked my reserve chute configuration, said he wanted to understand regiment's setup for cross-training purposes. Williams's pen paused. "And did he identify any problems?" "He said it looked good. But it wasn't good, obviously, because your chutes failed." The implication was clear. Either Norah had made a mistake, or Wade had made a mistake, or the equipment had been defective. Those were the acceptable narratives. What wasn't acceptable was the narrative where Wade had deliberately sabotaged her gear. "I heard him on the radio," Norah said, pushing past the pain to get the words out. "During the free fall, he said something about the reserve not mattering, about me not remembering." William's expression shifted to the particular kind of patient sympathy medical professionals reserved for confused patients. "Sergeant King, you suffered severe head trauma. Your brain was bleeding. Radio communications at altitude are notoriously difficult to parse, especially under stress. Are you absolutely certain about what you heard?" No, she wasn't absolutely certain. The memory was already becoming fragmented, details blurring at the edges like a photograph left in the sun. Had Wade really said those things? Or had her oxygen-starved brain assembled words from static and interpreted them through the lens of near-death panic? "Check my helmet camera," Norah said. It was recording. "Your helmet was severely damaged in the impact. The camera housing was cracked, and there was significant water damage. The tech team is trying to recover data, but they're not optimistic." Of course they weren't. Of course the one piece of objective evidence had been destroyed. The universe had a sense of humor like that. Williams continued his questions, walking through every detail of the jump with the thoroughness of someone who was building a case. Not a case against Wade, a case for equipment failure or user error, whichever narrative was easier to support with evidence. After 30 minutes, he closed his notebook. "Thank you, Sergeant King. I know this is difficult. We'll continue the investigation and keep you informed of our findings. For now, focus on recovery." He left. Norah stared at the tent ceiling, trying to hold on to the memories before they dissolved completely. Wade's voice on the radio, his hands on her reserve chute, the way he'd looked at her in the staging area, evaluating her like she was a problem to be solved. But maybe Williams was right. Maybe her brain was inventing patterns from chaos, assembling conspiracy theories from the random noise of a training accident. TBI patients did that, filled in gaps in memory with false details that felt completely real. Except Wade had checked her reserve chute. That part wasn't disputed, and her reserve had failed in a way that suggested deliberate compromise rather than random malfunction. And he'd known she was going to pull early, had said so on the radio before she'd even made the decision. Unless she'd imagined that last part, the uncertainty was worse than the pain. At least with physical injuries, you knew what was real. With brain injuries, everything became questionable, including your own perceptions, your own memories, your own sanity. The door to the medical tent opened again, and this time it was a face Norah recognized. Staff Sergeant Wade himself, still in his jumpsuit, concern etched across his unremarkable features. "Jesus King," he said, approaching her bed with the careful movements of someone visiting a critical patient. "They said you nearly died out there. How are you feeling?" The question was so absurd that Norah almost laughed, which would have hurt too much to be worth it. "Like I fell 8,000 feet. Wade pulled up a chair, his body language all professional concern. "I watched the whole thing from the air. Scariest shit I've ever seen. When your main failed and then your reserve." He shook his head. "I've been jumping for 15 years and I've never seen a double malfunction like that." "You checked my reserve before the jump," Norah said, watching his face carefully. "Did you notice anything wrong with it?" "Nothing. I swear to God, King, it looked textbook. The pins were properly seated, the housing was secure, the ripcord routing was clean. If there was a problem, I didn't see it." He sounded sincere. He looked sincere. And maybe he was sincere. Maybe the sabotage idea was just her traumatized brain trying to make sense of a random equipment failure by imposing a narrative where someone was responsible, where there was an enemy to fight rather than just bad luck. "The investigation team is going to tear apart your gear," Wade continued. "They'll figure out what happened. My guess? Manufacturing defect in the reserve. Probably something with the canopy deployment bag. We've had issues with that contractor before. That was plausible. Military equipment was built by the lowest bidder, and quality control was sometimes aspirational rather than actual. A defective deployment bag could absolutely cause the kind of failure Norah had experienced. "You said something on the radio," Norah said, the words coming out before she could second-guess them. "During the jump, something about the reserve not mattering." Wade's expression didn't change, or rather, it changed in exactly the way you'd expect. Confusion, followed by concern. "King, I don't think I was even on your frequency during the jump. We were on the Delta net. You guys were on Regiment. And I sure as hell wouldn't say something like that." Why would I? Why would he? That was the question that kept circling back. If Wade had sabotaged her gear, what was his motivation? They barely knew each other. They'd never deployed together, never had any kind of conflict. The only interaction they'd had was his skeptical comment about diversity checkboxes, and that wasn't exactly grounds for attempted murder. "Brain injuries mess with memory," Wade said gently. "I've seen it before. You probably heard something else, someone else, and your brain is trying to fit it into a pattern. That's normal. It doesn't mean you're crazy." He stayed for another 10 minutes, offering reassurance and support in a way that felt genuine. When he left, Norah was more confused than before. Either Wade was an exceptional actor, or she really had imagined the whole thing. The uncertainty settled over her like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. The transfer to Walter Reed had been necessitated by complications with her subdural hematoma. The bleeding had worsened despite the mannitol, and the neurosurgeons had needed to drill burr holes in her skull to relieve the pressure. The surgery had been successful, but it had added another layer of cognitive impairment to an already complicated recovery. Norah sat in a wheelchair in the hospital's rehabilitation wing, trying to convince her legs to remember how walking worked. The orthopedic injuries had healed enough that weight-bearing was possible, but the nerve damage from her spinal compression meant that signals from her brain didn't always reach their intended destinations. Her left leg was particularly problematic, prone to buckling without warning and sending her sprawling if she didn't maintain constant vigilance. The physical therapist, a cheerful woman named Sandra who treated all her patients like they were personally failing her if they didn't meet their recovery goals, stood a few feet away with a gait belt in hand. "Come on, Sergeant King," Sandra said. 10 steps. You did 8 yesterday, so today we're doing 10. Norah gripped the parallel bars and leveraged herself upright. Her legs trembled with the effort of supporting her body weight, muscles that had atrophied during weeks of bed rest, struggling to remember their purpose. She took one step, then another, her concentration so intense that the rest of the world faded to background noise. 3 steps. 4. Her left leg buckled and she caught herself on the bars, sweat breaking out across her forehead from the effort. "That's it," Sandra coached. "Reset. Find your balance. Keep going." 5 steps. 6. 7. The door to the therapy room opened, and Captain Williams walked in with a folder under his arm and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Norah's concentration shattered, and her left leg gave out completely. Sandra caught her before she hit the floor, easing her back into the wheelchair with practiced efficiency. "Sorry, Sergeant King," Williams said, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly sorry at all. "I need to discuss the investigation findings with you. Is now a good time?" Since Norah was in a hospital gown and covered in sweat from the effort of walking 7 steps, the answer was obviously no. But military investigations didn't care about good timing. "Go ahead," Norah said, too exhausted to argue. Williams opened his folder. "The safety investigation into your training accident has been completed. I'm here to inform you of our findings and recommendations. Accident. Still accident, not incident, not sabotage, not attempted murder. just an unfortunate series of events that could have happened to anyone. The investigation determined that your main parachute failure was caused by improper packing, Williams said, reading from his report with the enthusiasm of someone reciting a phone book. The rigger who packed your chute has been identified as Specialist Torres, who was found to have deviated from standard procedures in multiple instances during the exercise preparation. Norah frowned. Torres has been packing chutes for 5 years. He's never had a failure before. Nevertheless, the physical evidence shows that your main canopy was not properly stowed, which caused it to twist during deployment. The investigation attributes this to human error. And the reserve. Williams flipped a page. Your reserve parachute failure was caused by a previously undetected manufacturing defect in the deployment bag spring mechanism. The contractor has been notified, and all similar equipment has been pulled from active service pending inspection. It was a neat package. Human error plus equipment defect equals tragic accident. No one to blame except Specialist Torres, who'd probably face some administrative punishment, and a contractor who'd issue a recall and pay a fine. Wade wasn't mentioned at all. The helmet camera footage, Norah said. What did it show? Unfortunately, the camera sustained water damage that corrupted most of the video files. Our technical team was able to recover some fragments, but nothing that provided useful information about the equipment failures. What about audio? I heard the audio files were completely corrupted. Williams interrupted. We couldn't recover anything. I'm sorry, Sergeant King, but there's no objective evidence to support your recollection of hearing concerning radio transmissions. There it was, the official narrative. Equipment failure, packing error, unfortunate coincidence. Norah's memories of Wade's voice on the radio. Traumatic brain injury artifacts, not reliable, not admissible, not relevant. Based on these findings, Williams continued, the investigation recommends that you be medically separated from active duty pending full recovery. The Army's Medical Evaluation Board will make the final determination, but given the severity of your injuries and the cognitive impairments documented by your medical team, it's unlikely you'll be cleared to return to full duty status. Medical separation. The polite way of saying, thanks for your service. Sorry about the catastrophic injuries. Here's your disability rating and a handshake on your way out the door. What if I want to fight the findings? Norah asked. Williams looked uncomfortable. That's your right, Sergeant. But I should warn you that challenging the investigation's conclusions would require substantial evidence. Your personal recollections, especially given the documented TBI, wouldn't be sufficient to overturn findings based on physical evidence and expert testimony. Translation. Shut up. Accept the narrative. Don't make trouble. The Army takes care of its people, Williams added, with the practiced sincerity of someone delivering a speech he'd given many times before. Your medical needs will be met, your disability compensation will be fair, and there are numerous resources available to help you transition to civilian life. This doesn't have to be the end of your story, but it was the end of her Army story. That much was clear. Whether through medical separation or the longer process of a medical evaluation board, Norah King's career as a 75th Ranger Regiment combat medic was over. Williams left his report on the table beside her wheelchair and excused himself, probably relieved to have delivered the bad news without Norah making a scene. Sandra returned and suggested they cut the therapy session short given the circumstances. Norah agreed, too numb to argue. Back in her hospital room, Norah stared at the investigation report, reading through the technical details of parachute failures and manufacturing defects and human error. It was all very professional, very thorough, very convincing. It was also, she was almost certain, complete bullshit. But almost certain wasn't the same as certain, And without evidence, without the helmet camera footage, without anything except her own traumatized memories, what could she do? Challenge the investigation and be labeled a conspiracy theorist with TBI? Refuse medical separation and spend months fighting a medical evaluation board that would inevitably conclude she was unfit for duty? Her phone buzzed. A text message from Captain Reeves, her company commander. Brief and to the point. Heard about the investigation findings. Sorry, King, you deserve better. Call if you need anything. More texts followed from other Rangers in her unit. Martinez. This is bullshit. Thompson. You're the best medic we ever had. Others offering support, expressing outrage, suggesting she fight the decision. But none of them had been there when her shoots failed. None of them had heard Wade on the radio. None of them could help her prove something that maybe hadn't even happened. Norah set her phone aside and closed her eyes, trying to separate real memories from false ones, trying to determine what she actually knew versus what she thought she knew. The exercise was exhausting and ultimately futile. The brain injury had scrambled her certainty, and no amount of thinking would unscramble it. She was drowning in doubt, and there was no rescue team coming. The medical evaluation board convened in a sterile conference room at Fort Bragg, 3 officers seated behind a long table covered in medical files and investigation reports. Norah sat across from them in her dress uniform, which hung looser than it had 6 months ago. Weight loss from the injuries and recovery, muscle mass evaporated during weeks of bed rest and limited mobility. Colonel Harris presided over the board, a career infantry officer with deployments to every major conflict of the past 2 decades and exactly 0 patience for complications. To his left sat Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, Medical Corps, who'd actually read Norah's files and seemed genuinely sympathetic. To his right sat Major Brennan, JAG Corps, present to ensure the board's findings would survive legal scrutiny. Sergeant King, Harris began, his voice carrying the particular weariness of someone conducting his 3rd MEB this week. We've reviewed your medical files, your treatment history, the safety investigation findings, and your personal statement. Before we make our recommendation, do you have anything to add? Norah had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed what she'd say, how she'd say it. Professional but firm, acknowledging the injuries while emphasizing her capability. Requesting the opportunity to continue serving, perhaps in a different capacity, utilizing her experience and training in ways that didn't require jumping out of airplanes. What came out instead was, the investigation was incomplete. Harris frowned. Sergeant, the safety investigation was thorough and followed all proper protocols. If you have evidence that contradicts the findings, I have my memory, sir. Your memory, Harris said, in a tone that suggested memories were worth approximately nothing, has been documented by multiple medical professionals as unreliable due to traumatic brain injury. Dr. Morrison, would you care to elaborate? Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Sergeant King's CT scans showed significant frontal lobe damage, particularly in regions associated with memory formation and recall. It's well established that TBI can cause false memories, confabulation, and temporal distortion. That doesn't mean Sergeant King is lying. It means her brain is trying to fill in gaps with information that may not be accurate. So, when I say I heard Staff Sergeant Wade discussing sabotage on the radio, Norah said quietly, you're telling me I imagined it. We're telling you that we can't corroborate it. Brennan interjected smoothly. The helmet camera footage was corrupted. No other jumpers reported hearing concerning communications. Staff Sergeant Wade's testimony contradicts your recollection. Without supporting evidence, we can't base a finding on uncorroborated statements from a witness with documented cognitive impairment. There it was, laid out in simple terms. Her word against Wade's, except her word was contaminated by brain damage, and his was supported by every institutional structure designed to protect operators from spurious accusations. My medical records show persistent post-concussive symptoms, Norah continued, pivoting to the other issue. Headaches, light sensitivity, difficulty concentrating. But those symptoms are improving. My last neurological evaluation showed significant progress. I'm not the same person who came out of that water, but I'm functional. I can still serve. Harris consulted the medical file. Your neurologist notes that you still experience headaches 3 to 4 times per week, that bright light causes significant discomfort, and that you've struggled with memory tasks and executive function. Your physical therapy reports indicate ongoing issues with balance and coordination due to spinal nerve damage. Your psychological evaluation, he paused, reading, indicates symptoms consistent with PTSD, including hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping, and anxiety in situations involving aircraft or altitude, none of which would prevent me from serving in a non-combat role, Norah said. Medical training, instruction, administrative work. There are dozens of positions where I could contribute. There are, Morrison agreed. And if you were a civilian applying for those positions, your qualifications would be excellent. But you're not a civilian. You're a Ranger, Sergeant King. You earned that scroll. You deployed with regiment. You have a Silver Star for combat valor. The Army doesn't need another admin specialist. We have plenty of those. What we needed was you at your peak capability, and respectfully, you're not there anymore. The sympathy in his voice made it worse somehow. This wasn't cruelty. This was pragmatism. The Army was a machine that required functioning parts, and damaged parts got replaced, no matter how heroically they'd performed before breaking. The safety investigation concluded that your accident resulted from equipment failure and human error, Harris said, pulling the conversation back to official channels. Those findings have been accepted by the chain of command. Your injuries were sustained in the line of duty, which means you'll receive full medical benefits and disability compensation. The board's role is not to relitigate the investigation, but to determine whether you're fit to continue active duty service. And based on the medical evidence, our recommendation will be that you're not. Sir, I'm asking for the chance to prove— Sergeant King, Harris interrupted, not unkindly. You nearly died. You survived injuries that should have killed you. Your recovery has been remarkable. But remarkable isn't the same as complete. Even if your physical symptoms resolve completely, the psychological impact of what you experienced would affect your performance in high-stress situations. We can't put you back in the field knowing that you might freeze up at a critical moment, that you might second-guess equipment you should trust, that you might see sabotage where there's only coincidence. And there was the real issue, lurking beneath all the medical terminology and bureaucratic procedure. They thought she was broken in a way that made her unreliable. The brain injury was convenient camouflage for a deeper concern, that Norah King no longer fit the profile of a Ranger, that she'd become a liability, that her insistence on questioning the official narrative marked her as someone who couldn't be trusted to stay in her lane. My recommendation, Harris continued, is medical separation with honorable discharge, disability rating to be determined by the VA, and full access to medical and psychological support services. You'll retain all benefits you've earned through your service, including GI Bill education benefits should you choose to pursue further training. This board recognizes your exemplary service record and the sacrifices you've made for your country. It was over, not through any formal vote or declaration, but through the subtle shift in tone that indicated the decision had already been made before she'd even entered the room. This meeting was a formality, a checkbox on a form, a procedural requirement before they could process her out of the Army and file her story under tragic training accident. When would this separation take effect? Norah asked, her voice flat. We'll submit our recommendation through channels, Brennan said. Assuming no complications, you'd be looking at terminal leave beginning in approximately 60 days, with final separation 90 days from now. That timeline allows for completion of your medical treatment and transition assistance. 60 days, 90 days at most. After 9 years of service, 3 deployments, a Silver Star, a scroll she'd earned through the hardest training pipeline the Army offered, it all ended with 90 days' notice and a handshake. Do you have any questions, Sergeant? Harris asked. Norah had approximately 10,000 questions, but none that this board could answer. No, sir. Then this board is adjourned. Thank you for your service, Sergeant King. You're dismissed. She stood, rendered a salute that was returned with varying degrees of sincerity, and walked out of the conference room on legs that still didn't work quite right. The hallway outside was empty. She'd timed her arrival to avoid running into other Rangers. Didn't want to face the sympathy or the questions or the uncomfortable silences of people who didn't know what to say to a colleague who'd been broken and discarded. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Captain Reeves. How'd it go? Norah deleted the message without answering. She didn't have the words to explain what it felt like to be told you were no longer needed, no longer useful, no longer the person you'd spent years becoming. Didn't have the words to describe the particular pain of having your own memories dismissed as unreliable, your trauma reinterpreted as psychological weakness, your survival treated as an inconvenient complication rather than a victory. She walked through the hospital campus toward the temporary quarters where she'd been staying during her recovery, her gait still slightly uneven, her head beginning to pound with the early warning signs of another headache. The afternoon sun was too bright, forcing her to squint against the glare. Around her, Fort Bragg continued its normal operations. Soldiers training, vehicles moving, helicopters circling overhead in preparation for some exercise or deployment. The sound of helicopters made her nauseous now, another symptom they'd noted in her file, another piece of evidence that she was damaged beyond repair. The apartment Norah rented in Fayetteville was small, affordable, and unremarkable in every way. Exactly the kind of place you landed when you'd been medically separated from the Army and were trying to figure out what came next. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that was really just a galley with pretensions, and a living room barely large enough for a couch and TV. She'd unpacked most of her military gear into storage boxes that now sat in the single closet, a physical representation of a life that no longer fit her current reality. The dress uniform she'd worn to the medical evaluation board hung in a garment bag, unworn since that day. Her patrol cap, her combat patches, her Ranger scroll, her Silver Star, all packed away where she wouldn't have to look at them. What remained were civilian clothes that still felt like costumes, a laptop covered in Army stickers she hadn't bothered to remove, and a bottle of pain medication she tried not to take too often because the line between managing symptoms and developing dependency was thinner than she liked to admit. The headaches had improved, but they hadn't disappeared. Neither had the light sensitivity, the balance issues, the memory problems that manifested as blank spaces where recent events should be, or the hypervigilance that made her check doorways and scan crowds for threats that existed only in her rewired neural pathways. The VA had rated her at 70% disability, 60% for the TBI, additional percentages for the orthopedic injuries and PTSD. It was enough to live on if she was careful. enough to keep her housed and fed while she figured out what the hell you did with a life that had been completely reorganized without your permission. Therapy helped. The VA psychologist she'd been assigned, Dr. Patricia Okafor, a Nigerian immigrant who'd worked with combat veterans for 20 years, was skilled at navigating the particular maze of military trauma without falling into platitudes or patriotic nonsense. "You're grieving, Doctor," Okafor had told her during their third session, "not just for your career, but for your identity. You were a Ranger. That wasn't just a job, it was who you were. And now you have to figure out who you are without that identity, while simultaneously dealing with physical injuries, cognitive impairment, and the trauma of believing someone tried to kill you. That's a lot to process. Believing someone tried to kill you." Dr. Okafor was careful with that phrasing, believing rather than knowing, because the official record said equipment failure and packing error. And who was Staff Sergeant Norah King to argue with official records? Except she couldn't let it go. The memory of Wade's voice on the radio had faded but not disappeared, like a photograph left in sunlight. Details bleached out, edges blurred, but the essential image still recognizable. She'd heard something. She was almost certain she'd heard something. Almost certain. That phrase again, useless and maddening in equal measure. She'd tried to investigate on her own, in a half-hearted way. Called Specialist Torres, the rigger who'd supposedly packed her main chute incorrectly, and asked him about the investigation. He'd been bitter and defensive, insisting he'd followed proper procedures, suggesting the investigation had needed a scapegoat and he'd been convenient. But when Norah had pushed for details, asked if anyone else had accessed the chute after he'd packed it, Torres had grown suspicious and ended the call. She'd looked up Wade on social media and found exactly nothing. Delta operators didn't maintain public profiles, didn't leave digital footprints, practiced operational security even when ordering pizza. She had no idea where he was stationed now, what he was doing, whether he ever thought about that day on the tarmac, whether he felt any guilt at all. The laptop sat on her coffee table, lid closed, charging cable snaking across the floor toward an outlet. She'd been putting off this particular task for weeks, but Dr. Okafor had suggested it might help with closure. Download what remained of the helmet camera footage, watch it one final time, and then delete it. Stop obsessing over evidence that didn't exist, memories that couldn't be trusted, a conspiracy that existed only in her traumatized imagination. Norah opened the laptop and navigated to her external hard drive, the only backup she had of her personal files from her time in service. Most of it was mundane: training documents, deployment photos, administrative paperwork. But buried in a folder labeled Exercise Documentation was the corrupted helmet cam file that the investigation team had dismissed as unrecoverable. She'd tried to open it a dozen times before, and each time it had failed. The file was damaged, the codec was unsupported, the video player couldn't parse the data structure. But she'd kept it anyway, some stubborn part of her refusing to let go of the only potential evidence that her memories might be real. On impulse, she Googled corrupted video file recovery and found dozens of software options, ranging from free tools to expensive professional services. Most promised miracles: recover deleted files, repair damaged videos, restore lost memories, with the kind of hyperbolic marketing that suggested they were all scams. But one caught her attention: an open-source tool specifically designed for recovering data from action cameras damaged by water exposure. The documentation included technical details about file structure corruption, codec metadata recovery, and partial audio extraction, even when video was completely lost. It was free. It might work, and Norah had nothing better to do with her evening than chase ghosts. She downloaded the software, extracted the archive, opened the application. The interface was ugly and utilitarian, clearly designed by engineers who valued function over form. She loaded her helmet cam file and initiated the recovery process. The progress bar crawled forward, 5%, 10%. The estimated time remaining fluctuated wildly. First 3 hours, then 20 minutes, then 9 hours, then 45 minutes. Norah made coffee, tried to focus on the book she'd been attempting to read for the past month, gave up and just watched the progress bar like it held the secrets of the universe. After 90 minutes, the recovery process completed. 12% of the video recovered as fragmented clips. Audio degradation estimated at 40%. Metadata reconstruction failed. She clicked play on the first clip. Static filled her ears. White noise punctuated by the rhythmic sound of her own breathing through the oxygen mask. The video was a corrupted mess of pixelated blocks and digital artifacts, impossible to parse into meaningful images. But the audio, degraded as it was, had sections of clarity, sound of wind, the beeping of an altitude alarm, her breathing, fast and shallow, nothing useful. She skipped forward. More wind. Someone's voice. Completely unintelligible through the corruption. She tried the next clip. More static, more wind, and then Wade's voice. Distorted but recognizable. She's been asking questions about the Somalia routing. Norah's hands froze on the keyboard. There it was. Not hallucination, not confabulation. Not false memory manufactured by her injured brain. Wade's voice discussing something about Somalia routing, something about questions being asked. She let the clip play. A second voice, male, identity unclear, thinks she knows? Wade again, won't matter, reserves bin, heavy static, words lost, won't remember anyway if she... The sound of fabric deploying, her main chute. Wade, clearer now. Shit, she pulled early. Transmission cuts to static. Norah played the clip 5 more times, straining to hear details through the corruption. The audio quality was terrible, degraded by water damage and digital decay, but it was there. Wade discussing the reserve chute in future tense, before it had failed. Wade expressing concern that she'd pulled early, as if he'd expected her to pull at a different altitude. Wade saying she wouldn't remember anyway. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't TBI-induced false memory. It had actually happened, and now she had proof. Except the audio was corrupted, fragmentary, missing context. The words about Somalia routing made no sense. She'd never deployed to Somalia, had never been read into any operations involving Somalia, had no reason to be asking questions about routing through Somali territory or airspace, or whatever Wade had been referring to. And the fragment about the reserve could be interpreted different ways. Maybe Wade had been discussing generic equipment concerns. Maybe he'd been talking about someone else. Maybe the corruption had mashed together separate conversations into a false timeline. And even if she could prove that this audio was genuine, that it hadn't been doctored or misinterpreted, what could she do with it? Take it to Captain Williams, who'd already closed the investigation. Submit it to the Medical Evaluation Board, which had already processed her separation? Call Wade's chain of command and accuse a Delta operator of attempted murder based on 3 sentences of corrupted audio? She'd be laughed out of every office she walked into, labeled as a conspiracy theorist, who couldn't accept that accidents happened, dismissed as a bitter veteran with TBI looking for someone to blame. But she wasn't imagining things. She wasn't crazy. The proof was right there, degraded and fragmentary but real, and maybe that was enough. Maybe she didn't need the army to believe her. Maybe she just needed to believe herself. Norah saved the recovered audio clips to multiple backups, cloud storage, external drive, thumb drive hidden in her personal effects. Then she closed the laptop and sat in the silence of her small apartment, trying to decide what came next. The truth was out there, buried in classified files and operational reports she'd never have access to. Whatever Wade had been talking about, Somalia routing, questions being asked, reasons why she needed to not remember. It was connected to something bigger than a simple training accident. But chasing it would require resources she didn't have, connections she'd lost when they'd separated her, and a level of cognitive function that still eluded her more often than she liked to admit. She was one damaged veteran against the entire machinery of military institutional protection, and the odds of winning that fight were approximately zero. So she'd do what soldiers always did when facing impossible odds: adapt, improvise, overcome, find another way, wait for an opening. 3 months later, that opening arrived in the form of Major General Sarah Vance. Norah received the summons via email, a tersely worded message from JSOC's Safety Oversight Division requesting her presence at Fort Bragg for an interview regarding training protocols. No explanation of why she was being interviewed 9 months after the fact. No indication of what had prompted the renewed interest. Just a date, time, and location with the implicit understanding that request meant order, regardless of her current civilian status. She almost didn't go. The prospect of returning to Fort Bragg, of walking through the gates she'd once passed daily with pride and purpose, of facing the institutional structure that had dismissed her concerns and processed her out. All of it felt like voluntary emotional self-harm. But curiosity won out, and maybe something else too, the faint hope that someone, finally, was taking her seriously. The interview was scheduled in a conference room in JSOC headquarters, a building Norah had never entered during her active duty service, its security protocols restricted to Tier 1 personnel and the oversight structures that governed their operations. She presented her ID at the gate, received a visitor badge and escort, and was led through corridors decorated with unit patches from every special operations force in the American arsenal. The escort, a young sergeant with the expression of someone who'd been told to be polite but efficient, knocked on a conference room door and ushered Norah inside without ceremony. Major General Sarah Vance stood at the far end of the conference room table, reviewing documents spread across its surface. She was 50-ish, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested decades of operational service in difficult environments. Her uniform bore the aviation branch insignia, Master Aviator wings, and a service ribbon stack that included the Legion of Merit, Distinguished Flying Cross, and multiple deployment medals. Former Night Stalker pilot, Norah's mind supplied automatically. 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the pilots who inserted and extracted Tier 1 operators in conditions where conventional aviation would be suicide. The kind of officer who'd earned her rank through operational competence rather than political maneuvering. "Sergeant King," Vance said, gesturing to a chair. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." Norah sat, hyper-aware of her civilian clothes, jeans and a plain shirt that felt inadequate in this military environment, and her slightly uneven gait that had been visible during the walk from the entrance. She still didn't move like a ranger, probably never would again. "I appreciate your time," Vance continued, taking a seat across from Norah. "I know this must be difficult returning here after what you've been through." The sympathy in her voice was unexpected, Most flag officers Norah had encountered were skilled at performative concern, the kind that sounded genuine but evaporated the moment you actually needed something. Vance's concern felt different, rooted in actual experience rather than practiced delivery. "What's this about, ma'am?" Norah asked, deciding to skip the pleasantries. The email mentioned training protocols, but the original investigation was closed months ago. "The original investigation was specific to your accident," Vance said. "What I'm investigating is broader. A pattern of equipment failures and training accidents across multiple joint exercises involving JSOC units over the past 18 months. That got Norah's attention. "A pattern? 5 incidents total, including yours. 2 resulted in fatalities, 3 in serious injuries. All involved parachute malfunctions during high-altitude training. All occurred during joint exercises where regiment and Tier 1 units were operating together." Vance pulled a tablet from her briefcase and scrolled through a document. The incidents were investigated individually and attributed to various causes: packing errors, equipment defects, user mistakes. But when you look at them collectively, certain commonalities emerge. What kind of commonalities? That's what I'm trying to determine, which is why I wanted to speak with you directly, rather than relying solely on the investigation report. Vance looked at Norah with an expression that was hard to read. "The report says you believe your equipment was tampered with, that you heard concerning radio communications during the jump, that you attempted to raise these concerns and were dismissed as unreliable due to head trauma. That's accurate, ma'am. Tell me about the radio communications. What exactly did you hear?" Norah hesitated. This was where she'd been dismissed before, where her testimony had been discredited and her memories labeled as confabulation. But Vance's expression held none of the skepticism that Captain Williams had worn like armor. If anything, the general looked expectant, as if she already knew part of the answer and was waiting to see if Norah would confirm it. "I heard Staff Sergeant Wade, one of the Delta operators, discussing something about Somalia routing," Norah said carefully. "He was talking to another operator, asking if I knew something. Then he said something about the reserve not mattering, about me not remembering anyway. Did you know anything about Somalia routing?" "No, ma'am. I'd never deployed to Somalia, never been read into any operations involving that region. I have no idea what he was referring to." Vance made a note on her tablet. "And this was during the free fall? Before your chutes failed?" "Yes, ma'am. The audio came through my helmet communication system. I remember thinking it was strange, that maybe frequencies had gotten crossed somehow." "Did you report this to the initial investigation?" "I tried. Captain Williams suggested it was a hallucination caused by oxygen deprivation and head trauma. When I insisted it was real, he noted in my file that I was experiencing confabulation consistent with TBI. But you don't believe it was confabulation?" "No, ma'am. I recovered corrupted audio files from my helmet camera. The transmissions are there, degraded, fragmentary, but present." Vance's expression sharpened. "The investigation report stated your helmet camera footage was completely unrecoverable. The investigation team's forensic specialists couldn't recover it," Norah clarified. "I used different software, open-source tools designed for water-damaged equipment. The video is gone, but portions of the audio survived. Do you have these files?" Norah pulled a thumb drive from her pocket and placed it on the table. 3 clips, total runtime about 45 seconds. "The quality is terrible, but Wade's voice is identifiable." Vance took the thumb drive, connected it to her tablet, and spent several minutes listening to the recovered audio through headphones. Her expression remained neutral, giving nothing away. When she finished, she disconnected the drive and placed it carefully beside her tablet. "This doesn't prove sabotage," Vance said finally. "It proves there was a conversation. The content is ambiguous. Somalia routing could refer to logistics, operations planning, any number of things that wouldn't be concerning. The comment about the reserve could be about general equipment reliability rather than your specific gear. I understand that, ma'am. But it is strange, Vance continued, that Staff Sergeant Wade would be discussing operational matters on an open training frequency during a Halo exercise. Delta operators are trained to maintain communications discipline. They don't have casual conversations during high-risk evolutions. No, ma'am. And it's stranger still that he would examine your reserve chute personally before the jump, given that riggers are responsible for equipment verification, and Delta doesn't typically involve itself in regiment's pre-flight procedures. Norah felt something shift in her chest. Not quite hope, but its cautious cousin. You believe me? I believe something happened that doesn't fit the official narrative, Vance corrected. Whether that something rises to the level of criminal sabotage or simply represents poor judgment and coincidental equipment failure is yet to be determined. She stood and walked to the window overlooking Fort Bragg's training areas, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture Norah recognized from dozens of military briefings, the stance of someone organizing complex information into actionable intelligence. The pattern I mentioned earlier, Vance said, still facing the window. 5 incidents, 3 fatalities, multiple serious injuries. 4 of the 5 involved personnel who'd recently been exposed to classified logistics operations in East Africa. The 5th, yours, involved someone who'd served as medical liaison to units conducting similar operations. I don't remember working on anything involving East Africa. You wouldn't necessarily. Medical liaisons often support operations without being fully read into their details. But according to your deployment records, you provided medical support to a Delta element during a training rotation at Camp Lemonnier 18 months ago. That element was later deployed to Somalia for a direct action operation against Al-Shabaab leadership. Norah searched her memory, trying to pull details from the fog of 3 deployments that had blurred together into a continuous stream of heat, dust, casualties, and classified mission names she wasn't supposed to remember. Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti. She'd been there for 3 weeks, running medical refresher training for JSOC elements cycling through the Horn of Africa. There had been Delta operators in the course. She remembered that much. Wade might have been among them, though she couldn't be certain. What does this have to do with parachute malfunctions? Norah asked. Vance turned from the window. That's the question I'm trying to answer. On the surface, there's no obvious connection. But 4 of the 5 personnel who experienced equipment failures had one thing in common. They'd all logged inventory discrepancies or raised questions about equipment accountability during or after their exposure to East Africa operations. The pieces started assembling themselves in Norah's mind, forming a picture she didn't want to see. Equipment theft? Possibly. JSOC units operate with high-value gear, night vision, suppressors, specialized communications equipment, weapons optics. Most of it is serialized and tracked, but accountability in deployed environments is notoriously difficult. Equipment gets damaged, lost, or, occasionally, diverted for unauthorized purposes. And if someone noticed equipment going missing, they'd become a problem, Vance finished, particularly if they were persistent about documenting discrepancies, asking questions, refusing to accept vague explanations. Norah's hands had started trembling, not from fear, but from anger that was finally finding a legitimate target. Wade was stealing equipment, and I saw something that made him nervous, so he tried to kill me. That's one hypothesis, Vance said carefully. It's also possible Wade was involved in something he perceived as legitimate, perhaps a classified program with poor documentation, and overreacted to what he thought was a security breach. Or it's possible there's no connection at all, and we're seeing patterns in random noise. You don't believe that, ma'am? No, Vance admitted. I don't. But belief isn't evidence, Sergeant King. If I'm going to bring charges against a Delta operator with 15 years of service and multiple Valor Awards, I need more than corrupted audio files and pattern analysis. I need proof of criminal intent, physical evidence of sabotage, and testimony that will survive cross-examination by the best defense attorneys the Army can provide. What do you need from me? Vance returned to the table and sat down, her expression shifting from investigator to strategist. I need you to understand that what I'm about to ask you to participate in is not officially sanctioned. JSOC leadership is aware of my investigation, but they're skeptical of my conclusions. They see 5 unfortunate accidents, not a pattern of criminal activity. If I push too hard without evidence, I'll be accused of conducting a witch hunt based on speculation. Understood, ma'am. I'm organizing a joint debrief for all personnel involved in the exercise where you were injured. The stated purpose is to review training protocols and update safety procedures based on lessons learned. The actual purpose is to create an environment where Staff Sergeant Wade and his associates are forced to confront questions they thought they'd evaded. You're trying to get them to incriminate themselves. I'm trying to create conditions where the truth becomes harder to hide than it is to reveal, Vance corrected. Wade doesn't know about your recovered audio files. He doesn't know that 4 other personnel experienced similar malfunctions. He thinks the investigation is closed, that he's safe. I want to change that calculus. And you need me there. Your presence will be psychologically significant. Wade believes you're brain damaged, unreliable, no longer a threat. Seeing you participate coherently in a formal investigation will undermine that assumption. It might make him nervous. Nervous people make mistakes. Norah considered the proposal. She'd left Fort Bragg hoping never to return, had built a fragile civilian life that didn't include confronting the man who'd tried to kill her. Going back meant reopening wounds that hadn't finished healing, risking her mental stability for an investigation that might lead nowhere. But it also meant the possibility of vindication, of proving her memories weren't confabulation, of ensuring that Wade faced consequences for what he'd done. When is this debrief? Norah asked. 2 weeks from today. I'll need you to review all documentation related to the exercise. Mission plans, equipment manifests, personnel rosters, everything. If there are discrepancies, patterns, or anomalies, I need you to identify them. Ma'am, my memory is still compromised. I might miss things that would be obvious to someone with normal cognitive function. That's why I'm also assigning you a partner, someone with investigative experience who can help compensate for your limitations. Vance pulled out her phone and sent a brief text. She should be here in a few minutes. While they waited, Vance walked Norah through the basics of the other 4 incidents. The details were chilling in their consistency. Experienced jumpers, double malfunctions, injuries attributed to equipment defects or user error. 2 of the personnel had died on impact. The other 2 had survived with varying degrees of disability and, like Norah, had raised concerns that were dismissed as trauma-induced paranoia. None of them had recovered helmet camera footage. None of them had evidence beyond their own questionable memories. A knock at the door interrupted Vance's briefing. "Come in," she called. The woman who entered was mid-30s, dressed in civilian business casual, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that cataloged every detail of the room in a single sweep. She moved with the controlled efficiency of someone with military or law enforcement background, but her posture lacked the rigid formality that usually marked active duty personnel. "Sergeant King, this is Special Agent Rebecca Torres, Criminal Investigation Division." Vance said. Agent Torres has been working on a separate investigation into equipment accountability issues at JSOC. Our cases appear to overlap. Torres extended her hand, and Norah shook it, noting the firm grip and the calluses that suggested regular firearms training. Former MPs, Norah guessed. Former Force Reconnaissance, Torres corrected with a slight smile. Marine Corps, 8 years. Moved to CID when I realized I preferred investigating crimes to committing them. Agent Torres has been tracking equipment discrepancies across multiple units for the past year, Vance explained. Her investigation has identified over $2 million in missing or unaccounted for specialized gear, night vision devices, weapon systems, communications equipment, optics. Most units attribute these losses to combat damage or administrative errors, but the patterns suggest something more systematic. Organized theft, Torres said bluntly. Someone with access to serialized equipment manifests, knowledge of accountability procedures, and enough operational credibility to avoid suspicion. Every time we get close to identifying suspects, documentation disappears or witnesses become uncooperative, or they have training accidents, Norah added quietly. Torres nodded. Or that. 3 of the personnel who'd flagged inventory discrepancies in my investigation correspond to casualties in General Vance's pattern analysis, including you. So this is bigger than Wade. Much bigger, Vance confirmed. Wade is likely a participant, possibly even an organizer. But equipment theft at this scale requires infrastructure, buyers, transportation, documentation falsification, multiple accomplices across several units. We're looking at what might be a criminal enterprise embedded within JSOC's operational structure. The scope of it was staggering. Norah had expected personal vendetta, maybe a single bad actor covering his tracks. Instead, she was being told she'd stumbled into the periphery of an organized crime operation running inside the military's most elite units. Why would Wade risk attempted murder over equipment theft? Norah asked. The worst he'd face for stealing gear is a court-martial and discharge. Attempted murder is Leavenworth for decades. Because it wasn't supposed to be murder, Torres said. Your reserve was rigged to partially deploy, enough to prevent instant death, not enough to prevent serious injury. Wade wanted you incapacitated, unreliable, brain damaged enough that any accusations you made would be dismissed as trauma symptoms. He wanted to discredit me, not kill me. Exactly. And it almost worked. If you hadn't recovered that audio, if you hadn't kept pushing despite being told you were crazy, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You'd be a disability statistic and Wade would still be operating freely. Norah absorbed this, trying to reconcile the methodical cruelty of the plan with the concept of a fellow soldier. Wade hadn't acted in heat of passion or combat stress. He'd deliberately engineered her fall, had calculated the precise level of injury that would destroy her credibility without making her a martyr. It was, in its own terrible way, professional. The kind of cold-blooded problem-solving that made good operators and terrible human beings. What do you need me to do? Norah asked. Torres pulled out a laptop and opened a spreadsheet that made Norah's head hurt just looking at it. Thousands of entries tracking equipment serial numbers, unit assignments, deployment dates, and accountability status. I need you to review every piece of equipment assigned to the exercise where you were injured. Look for discrepancies. Gear that was signed out but not signed back in. Serial numbers that don't match manifest records. Equipment listed as damaged that was actually functional. That's going to take weeks. You have 2 weeks, Torres said, until the joint debrief. And you won't be doing it alone. I'll walk you through the accountability systems, help you identify what's normal versus what's suspicious. Vance stood, signaling that the meeting was concluding. Sergeant King, I need to be clear about the risks here. If Wade realizes we're investigating him, if he feels threatened, he might become desperate. Desperate people do unpredictable things. I can't offer you official protection. You're a civilian now, and this investigation isn't formally authorized. What I can offer is the opportunity to ensure that your injuries weren't meaningless, that the man who hurt you faces justice. I don't need protection, ma'am, Norah said, standing as well. I need answers, and I need Wade to know that I remember, that I didn't forget, that he didn't break me badly enough. Vance's expression softened slightly. You're still a Ranger, Sergeant King. Medically separated or not, that doesn't change. Rangers don't quit. It was a small thing, that acknowledgement, but it mattered more than Vance probably knew. Norah hadn't felt like a Ranger in months, had felt like a broken veteran with TBI, a disability statistic, a cautionary tale about training accidents. Hearing a general officer affirm her identity, validate her service, acknowledge that separation hadn't erased what she'd earned. It was the first time since the fall that someone in authority had treated her like she still mattered. I'll review the equipment manifests, Norah said. Find the discrepancies, and I'll be at that debrief, ready to face Wade. Good, Vance said. Agent Torres will coordinate with you on logistics. And Sergeant King, be careful. We're dealing with people who've already demonstrated they're willing to hurt fellow soldiers to protect their operation. Don't underestimate them. Norah left JSOC headquarters with Torres, who offered to buy her coffee and start the initial briefing on equipment accountability procedures. As they walked across Fort Bragg toward the nearest Green Beans Cafe, Norah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. She had a mission again. It wasn't the mission she'd trained for, wasn't what she'd envisioned when she'd earned her Ranger scroll, but it was a mission nonetheless, one that mattered, one that might prevent other soldiers from experiencing what she'd gone through, one that might prove her memories were real and her trauma was valid. And if she got to watch Wade's face when he realized he'd failed to silence her, that would be a bonus. The equipment manifest consumed Norah's life for the next 2 weeks. Agent Torres had provided her with access to a secure database containing accountability records for thousands of pieces of equipment, everything from night vision goggles to parachutes to weapon systems. Each item had a serial number, an assignment history, a chain of custody that should have been unbroken from manufacturer to unit to operator and back. Should have been. In practice, the records were a disaster of administrative negligence, creative documentation, and occasional obvious fraud. Norah worked from her apartment, her dining table transformed into a command center covered in printouts, highlighted sections, and post-it notes, mapping connections between discrepancies. Torres visited daily, bringing coffee and experience, helping Norah understand what constituted normal accounting sloppiness versus deliberate falsification. This is the signature we're looking for, Torres explained during their third session, pointing to a specific pattern in the spreadsheet. Equipment gets signed out for a training exercise, marked as damaged during operations, sent to disposal through proper channels. But the disposal documentation is signed by someone who wasn't actually present, and the serial number shows up 6 months later on a foreign weapons auction site. They're selling it, Norah said. They're selling it, and not just to anyone. Sophisticated buyers, probably foreign military or intelligence services, people willing to pay premium prices for American special operations equipment. We're talking $50,000 for a night vision system, $20,000 for a suppressor, $15,000 for certain optics. Over the past 2 years, we estimate somewhere between $2 and $5 million in equipment has been diverted this way. How many people would it take to run an operation like this? Minimum, 5 or 6. Someone with access to supply systems to create the paperwork. Someone in disposal to certify the equipment as destroyed. Someone with operational credibility to explain away missing gear during exercises. Someone to handle the actual sales and money laundering. And someone to enforce discipline. Make sure no one asks too many questions. Wade. Possibly. We're still building the full network. But Wade's name appears repeatedly in exercise rosters where equipment went missing. He's also got the operational background, multiple deployments, extensive combat experience, the kind of resume that makes people trust him and not question his actions. Norah returned to the spreadsheet, searching for the exercise where she'd been injured. The equipment manifest was extensive. 40 jumpers meant 40 parachute systems, plus backup equipment, oxygen systems, communications gear, medical supplies. She started cross-referencing serial numbers against pre-exercise inventory and post-exercise returns. 3 hours later, she found it. "Torres," she said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "Look at this." Torres leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the highlighted section. PVS-31 night vision systems. 5 units signed out for the exercise, 4 returned, 1 listed as damaged beyond repair. But the disposal certification is dated 3 days before the exercise ended, Norah pointed out. How could they certify equipment as destroyed before the exercise was complete? They couldn't. Someone backdated the paperwork. Torres pulled out her phone and started photographing the relevant pages. This is solid evidence of falsification. It doesn't prove who did it, but it proves someone did. There's more, Norah said, scrolling through additional entries. 2 suppressors signed out to Delta Element. Both returned, but the serial numbers on the return don't match the serial numbers on the sign-out. Someone swapped them. Old worn suppressors returned in place of new ones. The new ones get sold. The old ones get recorded as still in inventory. Classic switcheroo. Torres made more notes. You're good at this. Ever considered investigative work as a second career? I'm a medic. I'm trained to identify problems. Same skill set, different application. They continued working through the manifest, finding discrepancy after discrepancy. Equipment that disappeared and reappeared with different serial numbers. Documentation signed by personnel who weren't present. Disposal records that contradicted exercise timelines. By the end of the day, they'd identified over $300,000 in equipment connected to Norah's exercise alone. This is what you saw, Torres said, reviewing their findings. Maybe not consciously, maybe not in a way you could articulate at the time, but you were medical liaison, which meant you were tracking equipment for trauma response. Medical gear, communications systems, anything your teams would need. You would have noticed discrepancies, maybe asked questions, maybe logged concerns in your after-action report. Norah tried to remember. Had she noticed something? The deployment to Camp Lemonnier was 18 months ago, before the fall, before the TBI had shredded her memory. She'd written dozens of after-action reports during her career, most of them forgotten as soon as they'd been submitted. But Torres was right. Medical liaisons were obsessive about equipment accountability, because missing gear during operations meant dead soldiers. If she'd noticed something and raised concerns, even casual ones, Wade would have known, and he would have perceived her as a threat. "We need to find my after-action reports from Lemonnier," Norah said. "If I documented discrepancies, if there's a paper trail connecting me to noticing the theft, already requested them," Torres said. "Should have them by tomorrow. But Norah, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that your reports were sanitized or destroyed. If Wade's organization has been running for 2 years, they've had plenty of time to eliminate evidence. Then we use what we have. The equipment discrepancies, the manifests, the timeline. It's enough to establish a pattern. It's enough to justify further investigation, Torres corrected. It's not enough for a court-martial. We still need proof that Wade personally sabotaged your equipment, that he intended to harm you specifically, that his actions connect directly to the theft operation. The debrief, that's where we get him to incriminate himself. That's the plan. General Vance has structured the session to ask questions that will put pressure on everyone involved. If Wade thinks the investigation is closing in, if he feels threatened, he might make mistakes, contradictions in his statements, nervous behaviors, attempts to shift blame. And if he doesn't, Torres packed up her laptop. Then we keep investigating until we have enough evidence to force a formal inquiry. This is a marathon, not a sprint. These cases take months or years to build properly. But Norah didn't have months or years. She had 2 weeks until the debrief, and after that, what? Return to her apartment, her disability payments, her civilian life that felt like exile, continue therapy with Dr. Okafor, processing trauma that might never fully heal, watch from the sidelines while Torres and Vance slowly built a case that might or might not result in justice. The prospect was unbearable. She'd spent 9 months feeling powerless, dismissed, gaslit by institutional structures that treated her trauma as inconvenience. Now that she finally had validation, had evidence, had allies willing to fight, she wasn't going to wait patiently while the system slowly ground toward maybe holding someone accountable. She was going to that debrief, and she was going to make Wade face what he'd done. The days before the debrief passed in a blur of preparation. Torres coached Norah on interview techniques, taught her how to recognize evasion and deception, helped her anticipate the questions Vance would ask and the responses Wade might give. They practiced maintaining composure under stress, staying focused despite cognitive fatigue, presenting evidence clearly despite memory deficits. Dr. Okafor was less enthusiastic about the plan. "You're putting yourself in a room with the man who tried to kill you," she said during their session 3 days before the debrief. "That's not therapy. That's re-traumatization." "It's closure," Norah countered. "It's proving that I'm not crazy, that my memories are real, that Wade didn't break me the way he intended. And if it goes badly, if Wade isn't held accountable, if the investigation stalls, if you're dismissed again, how will you handle that psychologically?" Norah didn't have a good answer. She'd been avoiding that possibility, focusing instead on the fantasy where justice prevailed and trauma was validated and everything worked out the way it should. But Dr. Okafor was right to push. The odds of everything going perfectly were small, and the psychological cost of failure might be catastrophic. "I need to try," Norah said finally. "Even if it fails, even if nothing changes, I need to look Wade in the eye and let him know that I remember, that he didn't erase me." Dr. Okafor made notes. "That's about validation, not justice. Those are different needs, Norah. Validation you can give yourself. You don't need Wade's acknowledgement or the Army's recognition to know that your experience was real. Justice requires institutional cooperation, which you can't control." "So I should just accept that he'll never face consequences?" "I'm saying you should separate your emotional well-being from outcomes you can't control. Fight for justice, absolutely, but don't make your healing contingent on winning that fight." It was good advice. Rational advice, the kind of wisdom that came from years of helping veterans navigate the gap between what should happen and what actually did. Norah knew Dr. Okafor was right. She also knew she was going to ignore the advice and pin all her hopes on the debrief anyway, because humans were irrational creatures who needed meaning more than they needed safety. Torres called the night before the debrief with final instructions. General Vance is structuring this as a formal after-action review. Everyone who participated in the exercise will be present. Rangers, Delta operators, support personnel, safety officers. The stated purpose is lessons learned and protocol improvements. But the real purpose is interrogation. Exactly. Vance will start with general questions. How did the exercise go? What worked well? What could be improved? Then she'll gradually narrow focus to equipment issues, accountability procedures, the specific failures that led to your accident. Watch Wade during this part. Watch how he reacts when the questions get specific. What am I looking for? Micro-expressions, body language changes, verbal hesitation. Most people can control their words, but their bodies betray them. If Wade feels threatened, you'll see it, even if he tries to hide it. And then Vance will introduce your recovered audio evidence. She won't play it publicly. That would be inappropriate in a group setting. But she'll reference its existence, indicate that we have communications recordings that contradict official statements. That's when Wade will have to make a choice. Maintain his story and risk looking like a liar when the evidence is examined, or adjust his testimony in ways that might reveal inconsistencies. He's going to lawyer up, Norah predicted. Probably, which is actually good for us. It suggests guilt. Innocent people don't immediately seek legal counsel when asked to clarify their recollections. After Torres hung up, Norah tried to sleep and failed spectacularly. Her mind kept running through scenarios. What Wade might say, how she'd respond, what would happen if he confessed versus if he stonewalled. Around 3 a.m. she gave up and made coffee, watched the sun rise over Fayetteville, and tried to convince her nervous system that today was just another day, not the culmination of 9 months of trauma and doubt and desperate seeking of validation. Her hands were shaking when she put on her clothes. Civilian business casual. The closest approximation to professional military bearing she could manage without a uniform. The tremor wasn't fear exactly, more like anticipation, like standing at the door of an aircraft before a jump, knowing that in seconds you'd be falling, and all that remained was whether you'd survive the landing. The conference room at JSOC headquarters was larger than the one where Norah had first met with General Vance, designed to accommodate 40 personnel, with tables arranged in a U-shape facing a presentation screen. Norah arrived early with Agent Torres, taking seats along the back wall where they could observe without being obvious participants. Personnel filtered in gradually. Rangers from Norah's former battalion, some acknowledging her with nods or brief words, others pretending not to see her. Support staff from the exercise, safety officers who'd investigated the incident, and finally, the Delta operators, 8 of them, including Wade, all moving with the casual confidence of people who knew they were the deadliest humans in any room they entered. Wade saw Norah immediately. His expression flickered, surprise, quickly masked, replaced by polite neutrality. He nodded to her the same way he'd nodded to other personnel, acknowledging her presence without specific recognition. But Norah had caught that initial reaction, that moment where he'd clearly not expected to see her here. Good. Let him be off balance. Let him wonder what she knew. General Vance entered precisely at the scheduled start time, accompanied by 2 colonels from JSOC Safety Oversight and Captain Williams from the original investigation. She took position at the head of the tables and waited for conversations to die down. "Thank you all for making time for this after-action review," Vance began, her voice carrying the authority of 2 stars and 25 years of operational service. "I know many of you have deployed since the training exercise we're here to discuss, and I appreciate your willingness to revisit what was, for many, a traumatic experience. She clicked through the first few slides of a presentation. Overview of the exercise objectives, participating units, training scenarios, standard military briefing format, putting everyone at ease with familiar structure. The primary purpose of this review is to improve joint training protocols and prevent future accidents. Vance continued. We've had 5 serious incidents involving parachute malfunctions during JSOC joint exercises over the past 2 years. That's a statistical anomaly that requires examination. We need to understand what's causing these failures and how to prevent them. Someone asked a question about equipment manufacturers. Someone else raised concerns about rigor training standards. The discussion was technical and procedural, exactly the kind of safety-focused conversation that happened after any accident. But Norah noticed Wade sitting very still, his eyes fixed on the presentation screen, his body language carefully controlled. Most of the other Delta operators were relaxed, occasionally contributing comments or questions. Wade was silent, watchful, evaluating. Vance moved to the next section, equipment accountability. She displayed statistics showing increased rates of equipment loss across JSOC units, trends in disposal certifications, patterns in inventory discrepancies. We've identified over $3 million in specialized equipment that's been listed as destroyed or lost in action over the past 2 years, Vance said. Some of this is legitimate. Combat operations are hard on gear, but the rate has increased significantly compared to historical norms, and disposal documentation shows irregularities. Captain Williams, who'd clearly not been briefed on where this was going, looked confused. Several Rangers exchanged glances. The Delta operators' collective body language shifted subtly. Not panic, but heightened attention. For example, Vance continued, clicking to a new slide. During the exercise where Sergeant King was injured, 5 night vision systems were signed out, but only 4 were returned. The 5th was certified as destroyed due to impact damage during operations. However, the disposal certification is dated 3 days before the exercise concluded. Wade's jaw tightened. Barely visible, easily missed if you weren't watching specifically for reactions, but Norah saw it. Similarly, Vance went on, 2 suppressors signed out to the Delta element were returned, but with serial numbers that don't match the sign-out documentation. When we attempted to locate the original suppressors, we found they'd been certified as destroyed, again, with paperwork predating the exercise completion. One of the other Delta operators, the man Norah remembered as Wade's frequent companion during the exercise, spoke up. "Ma'am, accounting errors happen. Someone probably transposed numbers when entering serial data." "That's possible," Vance agreed. "Except we've found the same pattern in 4 other exercises. Equipment goes missing, gets certified as destroyed with backdated paperwork, and the disposal officer's signature belongs to someone who wasn't actually present. That's not accounting errors. That's systematic falsification." The room had gone very quiet. This was no longer a safety debrief. It was an accusation.